This talk will be about one of the largest social dance crazes in history, the mid-19th century flourishing of social ballroom dancing throughout America and Europe. Now, today I've heard the 19th century referred to as the Age of the Waltz. And there are other important dances in that century, as you will see, but the Age of the Waltz label is understandable because the waltz set a new prototype for 2 centuries to come of close couple partner dancing, not only for the physical connection in partner dancing, but also the social relationships on the dance floor. The waltz was, of course, polite society's first closed couple turning dance. It had been slowly spreading through Germany during the 18th century, and then the French bourgeoisie took it up enthusiastically immediately after the French Revolution. Paris alone had nearly 700 dance halls then. A German traveler to Paris in 1804 stated, quote, "This love for the waltz and this adoption of the German dance is quite new and has become one of the vulgar fashions, like smoking," close quote. Vienna's mass fascination with the waltz is well known, beginning around the turn of the 19th century, with many stories about a large percentage of the city's population going out waltzing many times a week, if not every night during fashion season, dancing until dawn. But it wasn't until the Regency era, around 1815, that English society adopted it. Thomas Wilson wrote his book on waltzing in 1816. Now, the waltz was criticized on moral grounds by those who were opposed to its closer hold and rapid turning. Religious leaders unanimously regarded it as vulgar and sinful, but so did some others. In the July of 1816, the waltz happened to be included in a ball given by the Prince Regent in London. An editorial in the Times a few days later gave a scathing rebuke. "We remarked with pain that the indecent foreign dance called the waltz was introduced, we believe for the first time, at the English court on Friday last. It is quite sufficient to cast one's eyes on the voluptuous intertwining of the limbs and close compression of the bodies in their dance to see that it is indeed far removed from the modest reserve which has hitherto been considered distinctive of English females. So long as this obscene display was confined to prostitutes and adulteresses, we did not think it deserving of notice. But now that it's attempted to be forced on the respectable classes of society by the civil example of their superiors, we feel it a duty to warn every parent against exposing his daughter to so fatal a contagion." Close quote. But despite reservations concerning the waltz, social dancing in general flourished during the Regency era, with a marked increase in public and private balls, and the growth of dancing academies to teach the new steps, and the publication of dozens of dance instruction manuals. Dancing became an essential focus of social life, especially for the emerging middle class, which was rapidly gaining in its reach for respectability. The quadrille from Paris was first seen in the ballrooms of London in 1816, and variety was provided by the continuation of the old English country dances and the cotillions and Scotch reels, along with the écossaise, and even appearances of the older minuet, most of which are shown in this panorama. The Polish mazurka was introduced into English ballrooms at that time, with Hart's first set of mazurkas, also known as Hart's Royal Mazurkas, with music and description of steps and figures. Now, the Polish name of the dance was mazur, but the English ambassador to Russia, the Duke of Devonshire, brought it back from St. Petersburg, where they had Russianized the word mazur into mazurka. So that's how the name of the dance became standardized in the English language as mazurka, because the Duke of Devonshire brought the Russianized version back to England. The parlor cotillion, soon to be known as the German, was also new in Western Europe at this time, the Regency era. This new cotillion was different from the 17th century squared set dance called cotillion, even though it had the same name. And then, after a century and a half of French dominance in dancing, London now became the fountainhead for the new styles and standards and fashions. And then, Here is one of the most important developments of this new era. In the ballroom, the rigid hierarchy of Baroque court protocol and the display of performative dances, that was replaced by a more egalitarian set of guidelines for deportment that emphasize selflessness and generosity, offered with even-handed fairness to the assembled company. The American dance master Saltator captured this even-handed fairness well in his 1802 book with this next quote. Now, normally in a talk with illustrations, I don't read quotations that you can easily read yourself, but this has those S's that look like F's. Not a frown appears in the group. Pleasure shines in their eyes. Conscious innocence frees them from pride. All with equal ease forget preeminence of rank. Now, I don't want to skip too quickly over this important point about the generosity of spirit that was emphasized in 19th century social dancing. The Philadelphia dance master Charles Durang wrote this as his very first rule of behavior. I think you can read it. Durang added furthermore, place everyone at ease in your presence. This is easily obtained by yielding a portion of your own personal comfort to that of the general company. Such amiable and self-denying deportment ever characterizes the polished and educated person. Close quote. And many dance manuals reprinted the following advice. On entering a ballroom, all thought of self should be dismissed. The petty ambition of endeavoring to create a sensation by either dress, loud talking, or unusual behavior is to be condemned. It is necessary to forget oneself in order to be occupied with others without affectation. Close quote. This ideal was new at the time and quite different from the elaborate socio-political protocols prevalent in the previous French Baroque courts. This new sensibility laid the foundation for the preference of more modest and simple dances in the Regency era over the ornate exhibitions of the previous Baroque era. And the ballroom attire was also more modest and simpler. Ladies' lightweight, empire fashions allowed freedom of motion, enough for the intricate footwork required for many Regency-era dances. Women's gowns were light and sheer enough to keep them fashionably cool, although they were at times too sheer when it came to the intimate embrace of the waltz, possibly danced with a stranger, to intoxicating music. Because of the perceived indecency of the dance hold and the spinning, the waltz was considered unacceptable for public display by most ballgoers at the beginning, as you heard in that earlier quote. Now, I don't want to overstate this fact, for the waltz did have some avid supporters, many enthusiastic waltzers, but its acceptance was far from widespread. And there was a bit of class division involved in the waltz's acceptance or rejection. For the lower classes, the waltz was essentially their dance, or at least it captured their fondness for a rougher fun. Then the upper class, they could always get away with whatever they wanted to without reproach. But the middle classes have always been focused on upward mobility, and they were eager to appear more respectable. So dallying with the notorious waltz just might result in a young lady being branded as one of those women and deemed ineligible for a decent marriage. One didn't know for sure, but it was best not to take the chance. No waltzing. English etiquette manuals of the period were rather conservative, and here in America, our etiquette books were even more so, often warning young ladies not to waltz under any circumstances. Social arbiters in Europe and America would continue to protest against the waltz, unwittingly creating a social pressure that would launch a polka sensation a few decades later. You'll see. Now, moving on, from the Regency era, like the calm before a storm, the 1830s saw a relative lull in social dance activities. Ballroom floors became somewhat sparser as the freshness of the Regency era began to fade. Now, although dancing for pleasure did not cease, its social importance kind of fell to the background. Many Regency era favorite dances vanished because they were no longer new and exciting enough to merit the great effort required to master their steps and variations. The intricate footwork of the quadrille, like chassé, jeté, and assemblé, simplified to ordinary walking steps around 1830, much to the annoyance of dance teachers who protested that walking is not dancing. Social ballroom dancing was also influenced by the Romantic movement at this time, with its poets and visionary dreamers. This was an era of exaggerated sensitivity, where it was fashionable to swoon or burst into tears at the slightest provocation. The Romantics sought escape from the industrial age, escape to artists' lofts, shown here, or bohemian cafes, escape to nature, oriental travel, political idealism, costume balls, hashish, and love affairs. Now, the sentimentality of the Romantic movement clearly set a foundation for their fondness for dancing. But a lesser known influence on dancing was the political idealism of Romanticism. How can that be? The Romantics were especially fond of lost political causes and developed an affinity for oppressed and frequently conquered nations such as Bohemia, Poland, and Hungary. Soon, the choreographies of French ballets began to include national dances from the Old World, which then gave ethnic motifs, especially from Bohemia, Poland, and Hungary, an additional status as fine art. Yes, folk dance was once the pinnacle of style in ballet. The Romantics also glorified the natural over the artificial, lending a special appeal to the folk dances of peasants because of their naive and unaffected natural charm. At this time, the waltz was gradually gaining acceptance in some circles, but it was still prohibited in many. So by the end of the 1830s, dancers were becoming restless and ready for something new. In 1840, the Prague ballet master Raab traveled to Paris to exhibit Bohemian national dances, including the polka, on stage at the Odeon Theatre. During the previous year, the polka had enjoyed successful debuts in Vienna and Berlin and St. Petersburg, and now the reception was especially favorable in Paris. Soon thereafter, French opera choreographers traveled to Bohemia to bring back more polka variations for their ballets. The renowned Carlotta Grisi and Perrault, shown here, danced the polka at the Paris Opera. Eugène Corrali and Marie Volée performed it at the Variété. And upon each viewing, French audiences grew fonder and fonder of the new polka. And by 1842, the dance began to spread from the stages to the public dance gardens, where off-duty ballerinas also went to dance. By 1843, a few young couples began to exhibit the polka at private salons and soirees, where their friends were so eager to see this latest sensation. More and more couples were discovering that this jewel of the stage was even more fun to dance than it was to watch. And then in the famous winter season of 1843 into 44, the growing interest in the polka suddenly accelerated into a polka mania. And that's what they called it. Almost overnight, all of Paris became fascinated with this new step, including the most influential dancing masters, Solarius, Corrali, Markovsky, and Laborde, who became tremendously busy teaching Parisians to polk. That was the verb. It was joked that Solarius, shown here, was so popular that the only hour that he had free was between 2 and 3 in the morning. And, quote, he selfishly insisted on keeping that hour for sleeping, close quote. The French teachers said they were openly proud of their modifications to the Bohemian polka, which they claimed was too primitive in its original form for polite society. These dancing masters claimed that they taught a refined, artistic drawing room polka, suitable for the most elegant salons. So I recently looked into this, and I found that actually it's true. French dancing masters, or some of them, did change the polka. You see, the problem with the polka, in their eyes, is that it was too easy to learn, and it didn't require a dancing master to learn it. That was a threat to their business. So they turned this simple side close side hop into a precise petit sauté, glissade, coupé, jeté, or a similar glissade, jeté, jeté. And that takes a little bit more time to execute. If you look at the French dance masters who did that, like Laborde, you'll also see that they slowed the tempo way down to 82 beats per minute, as you can see, in order to execute their intricate technique. This is what that sounds like. But other French dancing masters, including Solarius, kept the original 104 beats per minute. American dancing masters also tended to favor the faster 104 beats per minute. And the third possible category of Parisian dance masters were those who simply taught the polka exactly as they saw it, danced by the touring bohemians, and they just said that they had refined it to placate their critics. And yes, I'll soon quote some of the anti-polka protests that erupted. So until we have a time machine, we'll never know for sure. Either way, the Romantics loved this new peasant folk dance imported from Bohemia. Or was it from Poland? Or was it from Hungary? They weren't quite sure at that time, but the polka appeared to be a national dance from some politically oppressed country, and it was deliciously euphoric as well. So all of Paris was now polking. The Paris correspondent for the London Times reported in March 1844 that, quote, politics of the moment are suspended in public regard by the new and absorbing pursuit, the polka. A dance master affirmed that the polka, quote, on its first appearance in Paris, occasioned an anxiety and commotion that resembled an epidemic. Routledge's ballroom companion claimed the polka, quote, its popularity was unrivaled in the annals of dancing. Rich and poor, young and old, grave and gay were all smitten by the universal polka mania, close quote. This lithograph is entitled La Grande Vogue de la Polka, but rolling the R there in the French manner, and states at the bottom that the polka had taken over all of the districts of Paris. Now, the German dance master Friedrich Albert Zorn, he traveled to Paris to learn the polka, and he wrote, quote, rarely, indeed if ever, has a dance received so much honor or so much attention as was paid to the polka in 1844, when the whole world wrote and talked about it, and apparently thought little of anything else. Every newspaper contained essays singing its praises, he said, and persons dressed their hair a la polka, with pomade a la polka, ate cakes a la polka, wore gowns a la polka, and almost numberless musical compositions for the dance were published, close quote. Other writers added further that the dance created a rage for polka puddings and polka pubs, polka liqueur, polka hats, and dress materials. The polka dot became popular at that time. Here's a cravat pattern from the 1840s. The polka was first developed in Prague around 1830. So it took more than a decade for the polka to travel beyond its borders of native Bohemia. But once it became popular in Paris, it spread like wildfire throughout the world. This was the first time in history that the popularity of a dance swept through several countries, crossing the Channel and ocean in one single year. The English dance master Eugene Coulon traveled to Paris to learn the polka from Solarius and brought it back to London in April 1844. England soon went completely polka crazy. In America, the New York teacher L. DeGarmo Brooks learned it from a newspaper article in the Daily Aurora, then right away performed it on stage at the National Theater in New York in May of 1844, 1 month later. Soon the polka sensation began its spread through the states. Now, Americans were especially ready for the new step. After decades of social prohibition against waltzing, an entire generation had become fascinated with this forbidden fruit. And then in 1844, hundreds of young people who so dearly wanted to waltz, they found they could now do the polka waltz without reproach. Because the polka was so sunny and good-natured, it couldn't be considered lascivious. It was said to combine the intimacy of the waltz with the vivacity of the Irish jig. So finally, modest, respectable young ladies could whirl in the arms of a dashing gentleman without raising an eyebrow. And they did in most American cities, towns, and villages. The dance master, Charles Durang, wrote that, quote, the polka soon gained a strong footing in America. The young and old and the middle-aged were roused by its attraction. Thus the sedate and the joyous, the learned and the unlearned, the professor and the mechanic, all were taken with its vivid and inspiring music and simple step and followed its measures with enthusiasm, close quote. Now, as in Europe, talk of the polka overshadowed politics for many Americans. And many believed that the little-known Tennessee Governor James Polk won the race for the presidency in 1844 that year, primarily because his name was so fashionable that year. An English humorist doubted that Polk was even his real name, joking that Polk was a pseudonym that he adopted to capitalize on the American Polkamania. So in our country, it was the polka that finally gave couples permission to dance together in a closed embrace, a tradition that has dominated social dancing ever since. And for this reason, many historians today conclude that the polka was the world's greatest catalyst for change in social dancing. But you know, that observation is actually nothing new for today. 19th century writers made similar remarks. At the time, Durang stated that the polka caused so great an excitement in America, quote, that its introduction into society may be regarded as the commencement of a new era in the art of dancing, close quote. Rutledge's Ballroom Guide in London added that the polka had the same effect, quote, on every capital of Europe, and it effected a complete revolution in the style of dancing which had prevailed up to that period, close quote. To the Americans and English, the polka had the additional allure of being the rage in Paris, which was the world's fashion trendsetter. And as if we had not identified enough reasons for the polka's success, we should also note that most of history's widespread dance crazes have been for easy dances that could be enjoyed both by skilled dance lovers and by the less adept. The polka was so easy that one could learn it simply by watching it, or dancing with someone who knows it, without the necessity of a dancing master. And finally, the polka followed the dynamic of a fad, meaning that it became even more fashionable because it was believed to be fashionable. So there are almost a dozen different reasons for the great popularity of the polka, not even including the essential fact that it was fun to do, perhaps with the most fascinating creature in your arms, just when you might be looking for a marriage partner. And this was danced to spirited music by the greatest composers of the day, including Smetana, Waldteufel, Rubinstein, Lahner, Johann Edvard and Joseph Strauss, Stephen Foster, and Offenbach. In our country, there were also several highly respected African-American composers of dance music, most of whom also directed dance orchestras that played for society balls, especially in Boston and Philadelphia. Composers like Francis Johnson, A.J.R. Connor, and Isaac Hazard. Now, about these dozen different reasons for the popularity of the polka, you might be wondering, is Richard just trying to see how long of a list he can come up with? No, the large number of overlapping factors is exactly the point. The polka was twice as popular as any other dance because it had twice as many social and cultural factors behind its success. Indeed, some of the polka sensation was the result of fortuitous timing, of all of this coming together at once. You know, this is true of most dance crazes. Rarely, if ever, does a dance become an international phenomenon simply because an enjoyable new step is discovered. In fact, whenever a new dance becomes a hit, dozens of authors and dance teachers usually point out that that step had already been around for a while without attracting any attention. Only now the time is right. This was true of the waltz, the mazurka, the two-step, the cakewalk, the tango, the foxtrot, Charleston, rumba, the Lindy Hop, and it was especially true of the polka. It had been around for decades without attracting any attention. For instance, the German dance master Zorn wrote that when he traveled to Paris to learn the polka, he was surprised to find a familiar dance, which as a child he had learned from his father under the name of the Schottiswaltz, and which he, Zorn, had shown to his pupils in Dresden in 1835, in Christiania in 1836, and Paris in 1837. He continued that it was not, however, until 1844 that this dance became known as Paris. A critic later complained that he found Zorn to be a most irritating gentleman because he always claimed to have known about a dance before anyone else. But in this case, Zorn seems to have been correct. When I looked through German dance manuals from the era of Zorn's father, written in 1826, I found this description of the Écossaise waltz, the Scottish waltz, which indeed was like a turning polka, except that it predated the polka, which didn't exist in 1826, not even in Prague. And the polka had another forerunner. During the Polkamania, dancing masters pointed out that the polka was like the rotary gallop step of 1830. So the turning gallop step was a waltz in duple time, similar to the polka, but without the hop. And then, here in America, Charles Durang of Philadelphia wrote that the polka was of the hop waltz kind, which was already known to him. Now, he was referring to the old German Hopswalzer, which had been transplanted to his city as the Philadelphia Hop Waltz in the 1820s. Here's what it sounds like. It indeed sounds like a polka, and it looked like one too, but it was 20 years earlier. So polka-like dances existed in several countries in the 1820s and the 30s, but none of these early polkas caught on. The polka did not become hugely popular when the step was first discovered in the 1820s, even though it was fun to dance. The largest dance crazes only occur when the time is right, due to a multitude of social, cultural, and political catalysts. And that's an important overall point in the popularity of social dances. Then, in addition to it being the rage in France, England, and the States, all in 1844, here's a Swedish description of the polka from Stockholm, 1844. The 1840s also saw polka descriptions in St. Petersburg, Russia, 1845, in Italy, Germany, here's Poland, and elsewhere. Now, our story would not be complete without giving a voice to the opposition, for not everyone was enamored with this new fad. Here we see a couple about to dance over the precipice, a solemn warning. So as the premier dance of the day, the polka was now subjected to the kind of criticism that the waltz had previously endured. In the opinion of George Templeton Strong, it was, quote, a kind of insane Tartar jig performed to disagreeable music of an uncivilized character. The editors of the April 1844 London Illustrated News believed, quote, it's a waste of time to consider this nonsense. The Parisians have never imported anything more ridiculous or ungraceful than this polka. It is a hybrid confusion of Scotch lilt, Irish jig, and Bohemian waltz, and only needs to be seen once to be avoided forever. Close quote. George Templeton Strong never changed his mind. Years later, he wrote, I wish I had the man here who invented the polka. I'd scrape him to death with oyster shells. But the London News did change its negative opinion, publishing this illustrated description of the drawing room polka only 1 month after it claimed that the polka was ungraceful and only needs to be seen once to be avoided forever. So it changed its mind and now assured its readers that La Polka, as danced in Paris and now adopted by us, is elegant, graceful, and fascinating in the extreme. So, what do I mean by the Polkamania launching a dance craze? The polka revived the ballroom after two quieter decades, and dancing overall was once again thrust into the forefront of social activities. Young people fell in love with the turning dances and looked forward for the next opportunity to whirl in the arms of a favored suitor, or a cherished friend, or an intriguing stranger. The dance craze then grew several times larger than the polka mania, as the newfound passion for social dancing led to an appetite for more and more steps to enjoy. The rousing gallop from 1830 was revived, often becoming the last dance of a ball. And the mazurka, which had not quite gained a large following during the Regency era, was also revived, and now it became the ultimate saltatorial experience for the advanced dancers. Mazurka waltzes were created by Parisian dancing masters who combined the German waltz with various Polish and Bohemian steps, providing further challenges that the more adept dancers could master. All of these were in the 1840s. In 1850, variety was added by the schottisch and schottisch quadrille. There were also dozens of unusual couple dances, such as the Angoise, or Hungarian polka, the five-step waltz, valsa cinq-temps, which was a mazurka waltz in 5/4 time. There was a tango, said to be from South America, taught by the Parisian dancing master Barkowski in 1854. A popular supplement to the mid-19th century ballroom was the German, the parlor cotillion, which had continued to evolve since the Regency era into hundreds of genteel dance games, novelties, and figures, and which could offer amusing ways to find a new partner. Some of these figures survive today as children's games, like London Bridge, or musical chairs, and blind man's buff. Last but not least, the polka rage finally brought widespread acceptance to the old waltz, once it was discovered that spinning in the arms of another did not destroy the moral fabric of society after all. The many dances that spun off from the Polkamania were mastered by those who took the time to learn them in dance academies, as you would expect. But here in America, there was a significant movement of personal improvement, which started in 1831, and this was the American Lyceum movement. The American Lyceum movement developed from the lectures given by Hosea Holbrook at the first Lyceum group in Millbury, Massachusetts. Then it spread through groups formed in other states. As a part of this self-improvement movement, thousands of affordable dance manuals were published in which Americans could learn polite behavior and the latest dances by mail ordering these dance manuals. One could now learn to dance without a dancing master. This do-it-yourself style of dance manual was also new at this time. Previously, dancing manuals were primarily written by dancing masters for other professional dancing masters. But now dance manuals appeal to the average person who wish to be up to date on the latest dances. Thus, these dances were assimilated into everyday use in public and private ballrooms. A typical grand ball of the mid-19th century featured the full variety of these dances, from the opening grand march to the final gallop. All of these dances, often with quadrilles alternating with couple dances. One could possibly get by with only the knowledge of a few of these steps, but most dancers enjoy the complete spectrum of couple and set dances. Indeed, variety was an essential characteristic of this period. The dancing master Charles Hillgrove wrote, quote, "The lovers of dancing, like those of music, are ever fond of variety. Variety is and ever will be essential." Now, because the polka seems maybe quaint and old-fashioned to us today, it's sometimes a revelation to discover how fresh and daring and exciting it once was, or how very young the dancers were. Did you know that some Victorian etiquette books suggested that turning couple dances were most appropriate before marriage? Those who were married could dance the opening march and a sedate quadrille, or they might serve as chaperones to the young ladies. So, considering the early age of marriage in those days, these dances were usually done by those in their teens and early 20s. Very skilled young people, many of whom had taken years of classes in dance academies. Maybe youthful energies were somewhat tempered by the strictures of ballroom etiquette, but we should resist the notion that the early Victorian ballroom was stately or courtly or somber. No, many of these dances were joyous romps performed with youthful abandon, until the dancers became, as Durang phrased it, quote, red in the face and covered with the dewdrops of a high corporeal temperature, close quote. Metronome settings and mid-century manuals show that many of the dances were done to surprisingly fast tempos. Captain Knox reported that, quote, every ballroom was like a whirlpool. Dancing more resembled the driving home from Derby than anything else. The price of fans rose frightfully, he said, partially from the processing necessity of them and partly from the enormous destruction of them in the melee, close quote. Youthful enthusiasm sometimes resulted in mishaps and tumbles, or torn dresses and bruised toes. Here we see the dangers of a military ball. A man tripping on his own sword in the center, dresses shredded by spurs on the right, hair caught in the epaulette on the left. So yes, a mid-century ball wasn't necessarily stately or courtly or somber. And then finally, after 15 years of enthusiasm for the new dances, the scene began to change. By the late 1850s, the dancers had lost the excitement and novelty of a craze. Although dancing was still popular, it was not as brilliant as it had been. And in addition, changing ballroom fashions influenced dancing in an unexpected way. So what happened was that ball gowns had been expanding in size each decade of the century, and the accumulation of petticoats was becoming too heavy. And this problem was solved just before 1860 with the invention of the hooped petticoat. This innovation had its advantages, but when it came to dancing a bounding polka or an exuberant mazurka, the hoops were hopeless, often bouncing and swaying out of control and exposing an ankle. So the advent of hoops changed some of the dances. They modified the polka into a smoother version that became known as the two-step, and hoops effectively eliminated the mazurka and mazurka waltzes. And then in 1861, Prince Albert died, initiating a long period of formal mourning that further attenuated dance festivities in England. Here in the United States, that same year was the beginning of the Civil War that had its own dampening effect on the frivolities of dance. But despite these multiple blows, the popularity of social dancing did not cease entirely. The tremendous momentum of the mid-19th century dance craze continued the importance of social ballroom dancing far beyond the usual duration of a dance fad. Now, by the end of the 1860s, hoops were becoming ludicrous. The huge hoop skirts began to create navigational problems. A journalist wrote, quote, every woman today is a tempest. She cannot leave the room without knocking over everything. When the growing skirts could not expand forward because of holding a partner in waltz position or to the sides due to navigation through doorways, they expanded backward. Now, this is an important trademark of the late 1860s. This illustration is 1867. This is 1868. Rumors circulated that the immense crinoline fashions were about to disappear. First, it was rumored that Queen Victoria would discard them. Nope, she didn't. The same was rumored of Empress Eugenie. She didn't. Then Empress Elizabeth of Austria. She didn't. Many people had grown exasperated with the crinolines, but no one wanted to make the first move. 1870 was a year of many changes. This might have been the turning point solely from the age of these fashions and the dances. The crinoline look and those favored dancers were now a quarter of a century old and now belonged to new society's parents. In addition to this, there was the tremendous effect of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which France lost. Parisians led a bloody revolution that deposed the emperor and established the Third French Republic. Life went on in Paris, but it was clearly time for a change. It was at this time, 1870, that the designer Charles Frederick Worth finally succeeded in deposing the crinolines that he never was fond of. He drew the skirt up onto the hips over a padding of flounces, the bustle. This is a Worth gown from 1872. Worth declared that, quote, "The 1870 revolution is not so much compared with my revolution. I dethroned the crinoline." And then once again, fashions cause a modification in social dancing, in this case with a waltz. As you see, these gowns have a train. There were lead weights in the hem that swirled the skirt out away from the lady's feet while rotary waltzing, but the gent now had to begin by backing against the line of direction to get that started at the beginning of a waltz. In his 1875 dance manual, William de Garmo wrote, quote, "If the gentleman is so inexperienced as to force the lady backward, the lady should check it by immediately turning herself to the right or left, at the same time notifying him that it is dangerous." This illustration is 1875, the same year as de Garmo's advice. And this shows the dangers of long trains. It's entitled at the bottom, "Long Skirts in the Ballroom." So regardless of changes caused by the fashions, the dancers were changing anyway. Many of the dances that weren't killed off by the hoop or long trains simply died of old age, or they simplified, losing most of their variations. The mazurka and other complicated steps were reduced to character dances for children, performed for parents at dance academy exhibitions. As enthusiasm for dancing waned, dance masters, in an attempt to revive their clientele, invented hundreds of new steps to replace the old fading ones. Why did they do that? Well, dancing masters remembered from their early careers that the increasing enthusiasm for partner dancing in the 1840s and 50s resulted in the creation of many new dances. Therefore, they reasoned oppositely, that the creation of more new dances would increase enthusiasm and bring the students back to their dancing academies. So they formed dancing master associations with annual conventions and created hundreds of new variations on the waltz, polka, schottische, and galop. By 1890, Professor Melvin B. Gilbert, shown here, had compiled 500 of these variations in his book. But the dancing masters essentially got the cart before the horse. Enthusiasm leads to the creation of new dances, yes, but not vice versa. Almost none of these new late century variations caught on with the general public. And the repertoire of turning couple dances continued to dwindle in the late 19th century. In the 1880s, dance activity did pick up a little in high society ballrooms, but not because of any major innovations in dancing, but because of an increase in the upward mobility of the middle class. So here's what was going on. In order to step up on the social ladder, they sent their children to dance academies attended by wealthier families in order to mingle with their parents, like at Bornick's Academy in Chicago. And the middle class looked for opportunities to display wealth that they barely had. Even the wealthy were trying to outdo each other, as elaborate private balls became the centerpiece of high society. The parlor cotillion, the German, now became the favorite way to display one's wealth. Now, this is the late Victorian era, because each dance vignette was accompanied by lavish favors, presents offered at the conclusion of each cotillion figure, as a display of what they could afford. So meanwhile, by the 1880s and 1890s, the variety of turning couple dances further dwindled to primarily the waltz and the two-step. This is a typical ball card from that time. And here are more. Waltz, two-step, waltz, two-step, waltz, two-step. and the even larger repertoire of quadrilles. All of these from the mid-19th century, they simplify to just the plain quadrille and the lancers. This is the typical example. Two plain quadrilles and two lancers at a ball. And then by the 1890s, typically only the lancers. Here we see the lancers being danced 5 times in one evening, each time with different music. Among only waltzes, polkas, and two-steps, with no other quadrilles or set dances. Hey, do you notice here? The times of each of the dance are on the card. That's rare to find on ball programs. 8:15 in the evening until 2 in the morning. The last waltz is actually scheduled at 1:45 to 2 a.m. And notice that every dance here has a 15-minute time slot, including for a waltz. Isn't that interesting? This brings us to the end of the century, and boredom with this reduction in the variety of dances was one of the incentives for the explosion of the dances in the ragtime era that was just around the corner. But since I still have some time left, I think it will be fun to conclude this talk with a very unusual dance, which is also caused by this late 19th century boredom. Does anyone recognize this dance? Here it is. It's the Lancers Quadrille, as done in London, right around the turn of the century. This was known as the Kitchen Lancers, and these other names. And it was an especially boisterous dance, as you can see by the names like the Rowdy and the Breakneck. The name Margate there, that refers to this 1887 version. Notice that they're running through the grand chain in the fifth figure. So that's probably where it all began. And then it got crazier from there. The Kitchen Lancers was initiated by young dancers who were bored with the old Lancers and that repetitious order of waltzes and two-steps at a ball. So some of them began to play around with the Lancers Quadrille and then to downright mess with it. And then, surprise, it caught on, becoming an increasingly popular way of dancing the Lancers. Now, of course, most dancing masters at the time disapproved of the Kitchen Lancers. But fortunately for dance historians today, they gave very detailed descriptions of exactly what not to do. All of these books in my collection describe the Kitchen Lancers. I found 26 sources from that time describing it. The Kitchen Lancers was a combination of certain choreographic elements and the manner in which it was danced. One of the principal choreographic features was swinging partners with a fast spin in place, which would later become known as the buzz step swing, instead of doing a two-handed turn with walking steps that one should do at that time. This new way of swinging, this was first mentioned by Rudolf Radestock in London in 1877. Then Edward Scott went into much further detail describing how to do it in 1887. He also reported that the dancers found opportunities to spin partners and corners throughout the dance, in every figure, wherever possible. The manner of dancing in general was most often referred to as romping. And these are the line of 4 gents and 4 ladies in the fifth figure. Romping. And this is the bumping race figure that often concluded the Kitchen Lancers. So bumping race, that was named after the boat bumping races at University of Cambridge. Some of the tunes for the Kitchen Lancers are indeed college songs. In 1892, Edward Scott observed that, quote, "The young ladies cheerfully submit to being vehemently whirled and twisted around, and they seem to rather enjoy being lifted off of their feet. The Lancers are good fun, but you have to be particular about the fit of your shoes." So yes, that is the first image that I showed you. So it's rather hard to see what's going on here in this cartoon with everyone's feet off of the ground. So this photo is much clearer. Only the women have their feet off the ground, just as Scott described. Dancing masters call this wild and irresponsible romping. They criticized it as rude, objectionable, outrageous, and exceedingly vulgar. But others, at the same time, praised it. The smart thing nowadays is to be smart, and the noble art of dawdling, that means walking through quadrilles, has died of being overdone. If this kind of thing were not liked, it would not be done. Vox populi, the voice of the people. And you can see that those doing the respectable lancers on the right have a railing to protect them from the rowdy set. Prepared for the worst, the man is surprised. Oh, I say, don't say it's fancy dress tonight. What? Fancy dress back then meant a costume ball. The armored and padded women say, oh dear no, only we girls have been so knocked about lately in the kitchen lancers, we thought we'd be on the safe side tonight. This is from a 1909 issue of Punch. So the kitchen lancers remained popular for quite a while, 25 years, until the war in 1914. And now that we are up to the 20th century, that ends my talk for today. I hope you enjoyed it.